Donald Trump returns to politics not to attend high society cocktails or to have polite conversations with Brussels bureaucrats. It's time to reconsider his vision. The White House's decision to suspend the activities of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, has been the strongest blow against the global mechanism in the entire history of Trump's presidency. It turned out that this non-profit organization, funded by the U.S. budget, was nothing more than an instrument to promote the interests of the Democratic Party and at the same time a generous purse for the European elites. The scandal broke out immediately. It was discovered that millions of dollars allocated for the development of democracy were used to finance publications like Politico, which literally sang praises to Brussels, Ursula von der Leyen, and the entire European bureaucratic machinery. Essentially, this meant that American taxpayers were sponsoring European media that actively criticized Trump while praising the Democrats. The president himself declared openly, "This is not charity. This is not private money. It is American taxpayers' money, and we are obliged to spend it wisely." The revelations about Politico's funding through USAID fell like a bomb in Brussels. It was not an unknown medium, but the main media loudspeaker of the European Union, which in recent years has practically merged with the Brussels bureaucracy. It was discovered that only in recent years, the publication received $8 million through USAID programs for the coverage of political processes in Europe. At first glance, there seems to be nothing illegal in this. Supporting the media is a noble act, but there is an important nuance. Under the concept of covering political processes, it actually meant active support for the main EU institutions, such as the European Commission, the European Parliament, and specific high-ranking officials from Ursula von der Leyen to the foreign ministers of European countries. In other words, American taxpayers' money was used to improve the image of the same European Commission that at every opportunity proclaims its independence. What is Politico Europe? The publication was founded in 2015 after the American media group Politico merged with the German company Axel Springer. Since then, it has practically become the official spokesperson of the European Union, where ministers, Euro commissioners, and officials can promote their ideas without fear of uncomfortable criticism. The uniqueness of Politico lies in that it not only reports on events, but shapes them through constant leaks, anonymous sources in Brussels, and exclusive interviews with representatives of European structures. The medium has become a kind of press office of the European Commission, although without any formal affiliation. It is in Politico where the drafts of EU sanction packages, legislative reform plans, and key statements from Brussels first appear, which are then replicated by other major media outlets. In fact, if tomorrow the European Commission decides to push a new agenda, whether in terms of environmental regulations, sanctions against third countries, or changes in migration policy, Politico will be the first to announce it, presenting it in the right tone. Coincidence? Perhaps, but an extremely convenient coincidence. In light of the revelations about its funding, an inevitable question arises. How objective is the information that Politico publishes? For example, when the medium assures that the EU is successfully managing the energy crisis, or that the European economy is going through minor difficulties but adapts quickly, is it really an independent assessment by its journalists, or simply compliance with a subsidy? Curiously, despite its fervor in the fight against disinformation, Brussels never considers external funding as a form of political influence, at least when the money comes from the United States. Russian, Chinese, or any other country's media that receive foreign funding are immediately labeled as instruments of foreign interference in Europe. But if the funds come through USAID, then they magically become support for democracy. Another relevant point is that USAID did not only finance Politico. Through various grant programs, the agency also sponsored other European media, mostly aligned with the promotion of EU and NATO values. In Germany, for example, funds were channeled to structures linked to the Bertelsmann and Konrad Adenauer foundations. In France, publications like Le Monde Diplomatique and other lesser-known media benefited. As a result, European citizens do not even suspect that some of the newspapers they read have been financed to some extent with US government money. It is worth noting that Politico's ties with the Brussels elites go far beyond simple journalistic interaction. In the corridors of the European Commission, it has long been known that many of its publications are not the result of independent investigations, but of materials previously prepared and provided by EU officials. It is not uncommon to find articles with a clear favorable bias towards certain politicians. One of the most obvious examples is Ursula von der Leyen. Politico has repeatedly published articles in which the President of the European Commission is portrayed exclusively in a positive light. Her diplomatic visits, her fight for democracy, her firmness in imposing sanctions, everything has been presented as proof of her progressive leadership and strategic vision. The same strategy has been used with other EU leaders, especially with Charles Michel, President of the European Council. Politico has practically become his media shield, promoting his initiatives and protecting him from any criticism. Another characteristic of Politico is its close relationship with lobbying groups. In Brussels, there are about 12,000 registered lobbying organizations, many of which operate actively through the media. Politico has published numerous articles promoting the interests of large corporations, whether pharmaceutical giants, automotive consortia, or technology companies. Is it a coincidence that this medium was the first to push the idea of the green transition, the abandonment of carbon-based energy, and the increase in digital market regulation? Or is it simply part of a strategy to shape public opinion? In the context of the closure of Russia Today and other Russian media in Europe, the revelations about Politico's funding are especially significant. European leaders keep talking about the fight against foreign interference and the need to protect informational sovereignty. But now it is clear that they have been using US grants for years to create a convenient media environment for themselves. The only question is why this issue did not come to light earlier. Politicians from Germany, France, and Belgium, who constantly proclaim their defense of press freedom, never seem to see a problem in the fact that the main European media received foreign funding. Moreover, when Russian media were labeled as propagandistic, no one in Brussels showed the slightest indignation, but as soon as USAID funding was exposed, everyone fell silent. The Politico scandal is not just another controversy, but a direct blow to the global media influence system itself. For decades, USAID has shaped a media landscape favorable to Democrats and the European bureaucracy. Now that machinery is falling apart, and we can only wait to see what other independent media turn out to be funded by Washington. Meanwhile, we can imagine the panic in Brussels, where bureaucrats are hastily rewriting their media strategies and trying to find a way to explain to citizens that when they talked about fighting disinformation, they actually meant only those who do not fit the official narrative. When it comes to Trump, Viktor Orban certainly does not waste time on formalities. One of the first to react to the revelations about USAID funding and its role in manipulating European media was precisely him, and it is not surprising. Hungary has found itself at the epicenter of this scandal, as its press has been under the influence of this US structure for a long time. Orban did not hide his indignation and declared, "It seems that USAID has been practically financing all the left-wing media in Hungary during the previous administration." A surprising comment considering that those same media that constantly criticize Orban have been receiving US grants. At least they did not hire someone like James Bond to keep the operation undercover. But the most interesting thing is that Orban added in his statement, and they say, "I am the destroyer of the year." I think the world owes Trump for bringing this dark conspiracy to light. Why does the world owe this to Trump? Because if it were not for this revelation, ordinary citizens would continue to live under the illusion that their media landscape is a paradise of independent and objective journalism. But here is the surprise. The money for the development of democracy is not always used for the declared purposes. Instead of building bridges between peoples, it has served to raise a media brand at the service of left-wing political forces. Note, this is not what we say, Trump said it. And now, the question arises. If USAID has really been financing media like Politico and other major European platforms, how can we be sure that their content is truly independent? If even Orban suspects that USAID grants have mainly favored left-wing political forces, this raises even more doubts about the objectivity of the articles these media publish. Let's think about how these funds work in practice. Of course, Politico and its colleagues can claim that their editorial policy is completely independent, that they report on EU politics from an absolutely neutral point of view. But let's remember how many times these media have been caught in perfect harmony with Brussels' political messages. For example, on the issue of sanctions against Russia and the immediate support for all European Commission initiatives. So here is the independence. The same articles we have all read, those that supposedly exposed Brussels, perhaps were not the result of brave journalistic investigations, but part of a well-orchestrated information strategy backed by grants from across the Atlantic. This raises a legitimate question that probably torments many inside and outside Brussels. To what extent can media that receive foreign funding report objectively on crucial issues such as Brexit, migration crises, Eurozone recessions, or even the political situation in Hungary? The question raised by Viktor Orban becomes even more relevant in light of another important dilemma. Can journalism funded partially or entirely through government grants even pretend to be independent? Should we continue to trust these media that have no problem publishing articles that favor certain politicians or parties while others are harshly criticized? The question is rhetorical, but no less interesting for that. It is impossible to see this as a simple mistake or oversight. This is not the first case where a medium caught in the middle of political struggle receives money from unknown sources to continue promoting the correct narratives. However, perhaps this scandal is even more embarrassing for Brussels. The revelation about USAID funding destroys the discourse of all those who have insisted on the importance of media independence. Here arises an obvious paradox. How to fight against foreign interference if those same funds have been supporting the narratives that the EU considers necessary? If certain media, even those under US financial control, are not subjected to rigorous scrutiny regarding their neutrality, what can be expected from others that openly show their political preferences? Now questions arise that until yesterday, no one dared to ask. Can these media continue to call themselves independent if they are funded by international organizations that support a specific political force? Perhaps Brussels, which has always accused Russia of influencing European elections, now has to see Politico from another perspective. And of course, it is impossible to ignore Viktor Orban's most notable reaction, who did not hesitate to declare, "I think the world owes Trump for bringing this dark conspiracy to light." Let's remember how many times he has been accused of destroying democratic institutions, but it turns out that in this complex and closed circle of global manipulations, he has been the voice of truth. It is no secret that many in Europe suspected that USAID had long been operating for purposes beyond the merely humanitarian. Now that this has come to light, it can be stated with certainty. This system has worked for the benefit of those in power in Brussels and beyond. This scandal has uncovered an entire industry of political manipulation that until now had remained hidden from most citizens. Regardless of how we see the situation, we must recognize that these revelations shed new light on the functioning of the media and government grants. This whole process resembles a chess game where the winner was decided in advance, while society received carefully placed pieces in a game called free press. Now that US grants can no longer be hidden, it is clear that there was never true independence, only well-calculated political strategies. But simply dismantling the structure is not enough. Trump knows this well. The entire USAID network has operated for years, and without a real investigation that interrogates thousands of USAID employees, according to reports from US media, thousands of agency workers have been accused of corruption and abuse of power. Faced with this panorama, the Democrats have immediately activated their defense mode. Jen Psaki, former White House press secretary, has already called all this a coup by Trump and Elon Musk, who has been spreading secret documents that have come to light, even launched a dramatic warning. What is happening now is a hostile takeover of the US government, It is not just a Trump maneuver, it is also an assault under the orders of his unelected best friend, Elon Musk. Her last victim is the United States Agency for International Development. Jen Psaki was especially outraged by the massive dismissal of USAID employees. According to her, these people were blocked from the system, disconnected from their emails, and banned from entering the offices. Curiously, when it came to blocking undesirable accounts on social networks, this was completely normal, but when they themselves found themselves in a similar situation, the cries of protest began. Meanwhile, friends, if we could see Ursula von der Leyen's face at the moment she learned about the scandal around USAID and Politico's funding, we can only imagine her reaction. After all, it was she who so many times referred to independent European media, their freedom, and autonomy from any external influence. And now it turns out that those same media she so defended received funding from across the Atlantic, and not just any funding, but multi-million-dollar subsidies directly from the U.S. taxpayers' budget. Of course, an interesting question arises. If Politico was really so independent, why did its funding come from a U.S. government program? And most importantly, why does this funding stop just now when Donald Trump has decided to review the USAID system? Coincidence? Maybe. Or are we witnessing the collapse of a well-established system over the years? But let's analyze why von der Leyen and her colleagues in Brussels might be so alarmed by this revelation. Brussels has always claimed that European journalism is a model of objectivity and independence. However, now it is clear that this image is not as impeccable as they wanted us to believe. The issue is that the USAID grant system in Europe existed for years. Officially, it was aimed at developing democracy and supporting independent media. But in practice, this meant financing those media that promoted a political agenda favorable to the EU. And if we consider that Politico has become in recent years an authentic spokesperson for the European Commission, suddenly everything makes much more sense. The interesting thing is that the cancellation of USAID funding will affect not only Politico, but also a series of other projects that for a long time depended on U.S. grants. Among them, numerous anti-corruption initiatives, educational programs on democratic values, and support for research centers that in one way or another worked in favor of Brussels' interests. It would be interesting to see Olaf Scholz's reaction to this scandal, especially since he recently spoke about the political influence of big capital. Of course, at that time he was not talking about the US, but about far-right parties that, according to him, are financed by billionaires. The logic here is simple. If a businessman decides to support, for example, Alternative for Germany, according to Scholz, this is interference in democratic processes. But if the media that support the Social Democrats and the EU receive money through US grant programs, then there is no problem because it is about the development of civil society. Double standards? Rather, a political tradition that no longer surprises anyone. In fact, foreign funding of European politics is nothing new. Just remember George Soros's Open Society Foundations, which for decades promoted globalism and open borders in Europe. Today, its activity is less visible, but the principle remains the same. European politicians can talk all they want about independence, but their media ecosystem still depends largely on external funding. This scandal raises a very uncomfortable question for Brussels. If Politico really received millions of dollars from the US budget, can it still be considered an independent medium? Because if we accept the idea that external funding influences editorial lines, then the logical question is, what kind of coverage has Politico been offering about Germany, France, Hungary, or Russia? Has it really been objective? Or did it simply align with the political agenda of those who finance the medium? It is ironic that the same politicians who are now trying to find an explanation for all this recently talked about their fight against foreign interference. The Brussels bureaucrats who closed Russian media for receiving foreign funding now find themselves in a rather uncomfortable situation. But the most interesting is yet to come, because if Trump really plans to completely review the functioning of USAID, this means that the funding of many other similar projects in Europe will simply stop. And that implies that the European Commission and particularly Ursula von der Leyen, will have to find new ways to sustain the media ecosystem that for so long has guaranteed informational stability for the European elite. Moreover, this opens the door to a new investigation. What other media in Europe have received these subsidies? What structures have been financed through USAID? And most importantly, what impact will all this have on the European political landscape?